There is a concerning trend in AI research. Studies claiming large language models outperform physicians in diagnosis. Let's expose why these comparisons are not only methodologically flawed, but potentially dangerous to healthcare's future. These headlines from prestigious journals like Science are generating widespread misconception that AI can replace physicians. But let's examine what these studies actually measured versus what real medicine actually is. So what was actually tested? Essentially, they compared a chatbot's probabilistic ability to process text against physicians reading someone else's notes about patients they never met, which is comparing reading comprehension, not actual diagnostic medicine. Real medical practice requires face-to-face patient interaction, the integration of diverse clinical data, and the application of clinical judgment that goes far beyond interpreting text alone. By designing experimental conditions that bear no resemblance to actual clinical practice, these studies have produced findings that are not only scientifically meaningless, but dangerously irresponsible, creating false equivalencies that mislead the public, policymakers, and even fellow researchers about AI's true capabilities in medicine. A physician sitting with a patient integrates dozens of data streams simultaneously: visual cues, auditory information, physical findings, labs, imaging, and that invaluable clinical intuition built from years of experience, none of which text-based LLMs can access. To then handicap physicians by stripping away everything that makes medicine medicine, asking them to diagnose from someone else's written notes without ever seeing the patient, and compare their educated guesses to a chatbot's probabilistic output is an exercise utterly divorced from clinical reality. It measures nothing relevant to actual patient care, and any conclusions drawn from such conditions are scientifically worthless and dangerously misleading. This is a good example of why experience and intuition matter. Doctors often note that most patients claim to have a high pain tolerance. But the simple statistical reality is that by definition, most people cannot be above average. Just like how most people believe they're above average drivers. If an AI were to accept such self-reports at face value, would it simply reduce anesthesia dosing because a patient said, "Don't worry, I have a high pain tolerance"? A physician observes, questions, and calibrates dosing using multimodal assessment, behavioral cues, vital signs, context, and clinical judgment, rather than relying on unverified subjective claims. Chatbots are probabilistic systems that generate responses by predicting statistically likely word sequences based on patterns in their training data. Medicine, however, requires attention to the individual patient in front of us, not just what was most common in past cases. Because these models are driven by statistical patterns rather than true clinical understanding and can struggle with rare or atypical presentations, relying solely on statistical likelihoods would mean missing diagnoses simply because they occur less frequently than the one that appears to fit the situation. If a physician practiced medicine this way, the result would be significant harm, and there would be little need for a doctor at all, since anyone could look up the same statistics. Let's look at something far simpler than medicine: facial recognition. A man was identified as a 100% match by a casino's AI facial recognition system, resulting in his arrest for trespassing. He was held for 12 hours, despite having 3 forms of ID, showing he wasn't the person the AI had flagged, and the officer refused to verify any of the alternative identification. It wasn't an isolated incident. A lawsuit claims this facial recognition technology has led to thousands of unlawful arrests, pointing to much wider systemic problems. In another case, a grandmother was jailed for over 6 months after an AI system flagged her for fraud, even though she was over 1,000 miles from the crime scene. Society needs to understand that AI will always produce false positives and false negatives, and its outputs should never be accepted at face value. If we can't rely on AI to consistently recognize faces, why would we trust probabilistic chatbots to make medical diagnoses? AI absolutely has a role in medicine, but it must be task-specific, deterministic systems, trained for particular applications like image analysis or waveform pattern recognition, not general-purpose language models making probabilistic guesses about diagnoses. Even with deterministic AI systems, we need to recognize that they are not perfect, and that false positives and false negatives will still occur, just as they did in the facial recognition fiasco that led to false arrests. Depending on development practices and how honestly the developers reported their results, deterministic models can look impressive on paper while failing badly in real use. Data leakage and overfitting can inflate accuracy metrics that then collapse when the system is faced with real patients it has never encountered before. Even when developers claim they tested a system on patients it has never encountered before, doubts remain. When a study states that it used external validation, we must ask whether it was truly external or simply data from a nearby sister hospital using the same equipment, trained by the same programs, and serving the same type of patients. Genuine external validation is uncommon and should be examined carefully. In this new era, medical professionals must become sophisticated evaluators of AI tools. Understand the type of tool you are using. Avoid relying on probabilistic chatbots for diagnosing individual patients, and instead use deterministic, task-specific AI only in situations where it is appropriate. And even with deterministic AI systems, they must be evaluated with real scrutiny. Require clear evidence of healthy learning dynamics. Verify that the data was split properly between training and validation and testing. Question any accuracy claims by asking for the false positive and false negative rates. And ensure that any stated external validation was genuinely external. No matter how impressive the developers make it sound, you should always assume that false positives and false negatives will occur. Never take AI outputs at face value. All systems produce errors, so consider the consequences of both false positives and false negatives, and always rely on human oversight and clinical judgment. The real danger is not the AI itself, but the false narrative created by flawed studies. These studies give the public the impression that AI can replace the fundamentally human, multimodal, relationship-based practice of medicine. Poor research gets amplified by the media, convinces people that AI diagnoses better, and slowly undermines trust in medical professionals. And frankly, given how misleading and unrealistic these studies are, comparing simple reading comprehension to something that is not even clinical medicine, journals that publish them should be embarrassed. We must insist on real methodological rigor, beginning with educating ourselves about what AI can and cannot do. We need to understand which tools are suited for which tasks, how they generate their answers, and what kinds of errors they inherently produce. Researchers need to design studies that evaluate AI in real clinical settings, require multimodal inputs, and report learning dynamics rather than relying on a single performance metric. Clinicians, demand transparency in how AI systems are trained and validated. Ensure developers are using clinical data in ways that reflect real clinical practice. Keep clinical judgment central to all decisions and help patients understand the limitations of AI. Policymakers, establish strict standards for studies comparing AI with physicians, require disclosure of AI limitations, and invest in research that explores appropriate and safe uses of AI in healthcare. AI should be used to support and enhance human medical practice, not to replace clinical judgment with shallow or misleading comparisons. Remember, these studies tested reading comprehension, not medicine. Until AI can sit with a patient, observe their expressions, hear their hesitations, and integrate dozens of simultaneous data streams with years of clinical experience, the comparison remains fundamentally invalid. Scientific journals have a responsibility to uphold scientific integrity, and publishing studies designed mainly to generate viral headlines undermines that mission. When serious journals engage in such practice, they weaken their own credibility and blur the line between rigorous science and influencer-style attention-seeking. They are expected to set the standard, And releasing work that lacks realistic clinical rigor makes them appear less like leaders in science and more like participants in the online attention cycle. That kind of trade-off may yield clicks, but it damages their standing among professionals.